So thank you for organizing this, Gail. I really appreciate it. And so my name is Micah White. I am a lifelong activist. To give you some context about me, is I started doing activism when I was 13 years old. Activism is like the only thing I've ever done. And actually, I could always get a laugh at Davos by telling them that I've never had an actual job that wasn't activism. They thought that was really hilarious. So the only job that I've had, really, in my life is I worked for Adbusters magazine, which is like a anti-consumerist magazine. And so let's see. So just briefly, so when I was 13, I started doing activism. When I was 17, I created a campaign that got like national attention in America. So I was on national television, this kind of stuff. When I was 19, I went to Palestine, to the West Bank with the International Solidarity Movement, and I did a lot of direct action nonviolence where I saw, I was there 6 weeks, I saw lots of real violence, live ammunition being fired at protesters and all kinds of Molotov cocktails and all kinds of stuff. And then I came back and I did some peace work in Zimbabwe, and then I went to work for Adbusters, and then when I was 28, the founder of Adbusters, Cullen Lassen, and I came up with the idea for Occupy Wall Street, and we wrote this basically, we called it a tactical briefing, but it was basically an email to our network that said, you know, if we can combine what's happening in Spain, at the time it was this Uncompados Indignados movement, which was with what's happening in Egypt, which is at that time the Arab Spring, and the idea of going to a place of symbolic importance, if we can combine those two tactics and bring it to Wall Street, you know, that we kick off this revolutionary moment, which ended up being what happened. So what I'm going to talk about today, very briefly, and then we'll just have an open discussion, is I was asked to speak kind of about history of, I'll tell you a little bit more about the history of Occupy, some thoughts about strategy and my reflections on Occupy after it kind of collapsed, a little bit about my book, and then my latest thinking, my recent trip to the World Economic Forum, and some of the things I think on the horizon that activists should know about. So I just want to say briefly about Occupy. You know, Occupy was in many ways like a very special and I think unique kind of creation, because it came at a time, like, if anyone remembers those days, like preceding Occupy Wall Street, like 2009, 2010, and the activist movement, there was like a general sense, back then we would talk about the apathy. Everyone was like, why is this generation so apathetic? There was tons of articles about they're so politically apathetic and all this kind of stuff. And it's you know, it's true that like between 2003 with the collapse of like simultaneously the collapse of the anti-war movement and the anti-globalization movement, there wasn't a lot of like exciting activism between 2003 and 2011. There was kind of a dead period. And so when the Arab Spring started in first Tunisia and then spread to Egypt, and then when Mubarak stepped down, and then that ignited protesters in Spain to go into their squares and have these general assemblies, you know, at Adbusters, we like knew, like I had lived in Egypt for 9 months before, so I knew that this was like really a moment of political potential. But that wasn't a view that was shared with a lot of people. I remember talking to people at that time, and they just didn't see how this related to their experience as Americans. And in fact, in the days, just give you a sense of the political climate of activism, in the days leading up to Occupy, before we announced the idea, we reached out to some prominent activists in each country and asked them to write an article about whether or not the Arab Spring could happen in their country. So I had recruited David Graeber to write for Adbusters at the time. And I asked him, will you write this article? And his article, if you go back and read it, is no, the Arab Spring is not going to happen in America. And then Occupy Wall Street like starts like a month later. So like there was this sense that, which is much different than now. There was this sense that that wasn't possible, that you couldn't do that in these Western countries. And now it's completely flipped. I think we much more have the sense that it is possible, we can do it. And so the Occupy's creation is a lot different, I think, than XR. So one of the differences is that when we wrote this tactical briefing and we released it to the world, that is like the extent of what we did. And this creates a lot of contention to this day, because we defined, what we did is we gave people the template for a new strategy, a leaderlessness, and consensus-based, you know, we told them it would be consensus-based assemblies, and that we would come up with our one demand. And we intentionally like stepped back and let it be taken over by the participants. So although there's like 2 people who came up with the idea, Cullen and I, there's about 200 people in New York City who can legitimately call themselves founders. There are people who were like, received that call and were like, this is a great idea. everyone else said it wasn't a good idea. There's just like they were eccentric outsider activists, basically. And they started to meet weekly in New York City, and they're the ones who then, built or founded or whatever, prepared for that day, the first day. And then about 3,000 people showed up on that first day. The other key element is, and I think a crucial part of my kind of theory of change is like all of the mystical or accidental things that contribute to the birth of a movement. So one of those things was Anonymous. That played a huge role, because back then Anonymous was like actually a big deal, and they took our tactical briefing and they made it into a video. They just like read the whole thing. They didn't cite us, but they just took our words and then like had like whatever their little icon person read it, and that video is what really propelled it into the consciousness of like edgy activists. It got something like 100,000 views like very, very quickly, and then there was like a couple celebrities who got on board, like Lupe Fiasco. And Roseanne Barr was there on the first day of Occupy Wall Street, which is shows you it really cut across demographics. And then the key thing about Occupy is that there was a series of accidents that then propelled the movement. This is another thing that is like completely, I'm going to try to tell you the story of what is not told. So another thing that's not told is that for the first 2 weeks of Occupy, actually it was completely ignored. And what happened instead is that there was a series of accidents that propelled it into the national consciousness and then global consciousness. So the first one was that these women got pepper sprayed. And they were like, I still don't really know. I don't really think they were part of Occupy, or maybe they were, but basically they were like, it was cruel. Like they were like, they cried, and it was like a horrible, and it got caught on film, and it was just like, seemed like so excessive that I think Stephen Colbert this was back when Jon Stewart was still on television. He like put it on television and like mocked this police officer, like, why are you pepper spraying these women? But then again, it died down, and the mainstream left and progressives still ignored the movement. But then 700 people got arrested on the Brooklyn Bridge, and then the movement just exploded. So between September 17th and then November 15th, the movement spread to 82 countries and 1,000 cities. So it probably is spread faster and further than anything that we've experienced, and one of the things we're going to come back to later is like that it's, I think, a high watermark for what like a social phenomenon, what a social mobilization can achieve in terms of size and scale and speed. Anyways, the movement was ultimately defeated. It was evicted simultaneously around the world in like a 2-week period. And now moving into strategy. So I think it's really important to point out that like during the height of Occupy Wall Street, we did believe that it was going to create revolutionary social change in America. We were not, there's a lot of cynicism now, I think, but we were not cynical, because at that time, the Arab Spring was overthrowing powers that seemed even more entrenched than Obama. Like Mubarak had stepped down, so Tunisia's government had fallen. So we believed that. And so when the Occupy movement was like crushed and evicted, it was it's very traumatic for the movement. And a lot of people reacted to that trauma in different ways. So the way that I reacted to that trauma as a person who had been an activist my entire life was to wonder, why is it that my whole life I've been trying to create something like Occupy Wall Street because I believed that would create change, but it didn't create change. How could that be true? And so I moved to rural Oregon with my wife, and I started to like research and think, and like I wrote a book called The End of Protest, and which really focused on theories of change, and it really tried to argue that like the contemporary theory of change around that motivates activism is broken. And it was when I started to make that argument, it was very negatively received by mainstream activists, because they responded. Most activists, actually like every activist, responded to the collapse of Occupy Wall Street by saying that the movement was actually a success. It was a success because we changed the discourse. We introduced the like language of income inequality into the mainstream and all this kind of stuff. And then they basically just doubled down on street protests. They went into Black Lives Matter. They went into these things. They kind of they took what they did with Occupy, and then they basically just tried to repeat it ad nauseum with a series of movements until ultimately they have all run out of steam, basically, is what my analysis, because there was no period of critical reflection within the movement. And they really like did not want to listen to this idea that there was something like just structurally broken around the activist strategy. So we're going very quickly so we can get into questions, but the key part of my book is this idea of a unified theory of change. So I'll just briefly explain that. And the idea is that that there's basically 4 general theories of social change, and that most activism is premised on one, but maybe 2 of those theories. So the main theory is called voluntarism, and that's the idea that social change or social revolutions are the product of humans acting on their material and physical environments. And all 4 of these is true, but that takes the form of like direct action. Like if you want to create change in this world, you need to like disrupt things, you need to organize marches. And in a voluntarist mindset, what we quibble over or we disagree about is simply what actions to take, but we all agree that action is the thing. This is the core of activism, which is about acting. Of course, that's true, but there's other theories I think that also need to be taken into account. So the next one that we're going to go from like the easiest to accept to the most impossible to accept. Although within XR, I think that you have a broader concept of it's easier for you to accept these all. Yeah. But the next easiest one to accept is structuralism. The idea that social change results from not humans acting on their environment, but instead like, forces outside, material forces outside of humanity. So one example that's really, I think, helpful, well, this is common from like Marxist historical materialism, like the idea that you need some sort of economic collapse in order to have a revolution. But another one that's I think I always point to because it's really good is there's been some work on the idea that the UN food price index is actually the best way to a predictor for revolt. And there's actually what's good about this, there's these scientists who put forward that theory, and they put forward that theory before the Arab Spring, and they were like, look, world, like, food prices are going up, we think this is going to be, and then the Arab Spring like totally validated everything they said. And it's true that when the food prices started to go down again, coincides with the end of the Arab Spring, the end of Occupy Wall Street and this kind of stuff, and that food prices have not reached that level that they were before. So that's the second one. The third one, getting into the more mystical, is the idea that revolution is something that involves humans, but not the material world. And this is called like subjectivism. And so this would be like basically like theories of change that are like, well, our internal reality impacts our external reality. So we should do meditation and yoga and prayer, and like that we can somehow influence external reality through our inner subjectivities. And then the last one is the one that's hardest for most activists to accept. I don't know if that's true within XR, but which is, I call theurgism, which is the idea that social change results from spiritual forces outside of the control of humans. And the best example for this one is, I only discovered after I wrote my book, but is this theory of sunspot activity. Has anyone ever heard this one? We can talk about it. Okay. This is actually a really good one. I like this one a lot because it's actually really interesting. So there's this like Russian cosmologist in the early 20th century, and he, so sunspots are these like spots on the sun. They're like, and they're visible with the human eye. So humans have actually been recording the number of sunspots that they can see on the sun since I think at least 500 BC or something. Like there's like just extensive records of this, and humans have always been wondering, why are there sunspots? And so he went back and he discovered what he believed to be a correlation between revolution and the number of sunspots. So during periods of peak sunspot activity, revolutions tend to occur, was his argument. Stalin imprisoned him for this idea because it violates voluntarist and structuralist understandings of revolution, which is what Marxism was based on. Like, it suggested that the revolution wasn't the result of the great Bolsheviks, but instead something outside of them. But what's fascinating about this, and in fact, this is a really good theory to check into, because if you actually do correlate, like there's this, you can, if you Google it, you can actually find graphs where it's like, here's a graph of the number of sunspots, and then here's historical moments, and it is crazy. It lines up. It's like French Revolution, American Revolution, World War II, like all of the, like it really lines up in extensive ways. But also Occupy Wall Street, the first day of Occupy Wall Street coincided with record high sunspot activity. And we're in a period of very low sunspot activity. Yeah. And scientists believe that we might be entering into a period of like an extended low, we call it a solar minimum. Yeah.
Isn't that quite good for climate change though?
Right, and and there's also these questions of, so if you Google this, it's like, the sunspot is like, there's also questions about the relation between sunspot activity and crop failure and disease and like, all of this stuff, of course, like, no one's proven, because it's like, that's the thing about theurgy is there will never be a proof for theurgy because it's precisely it's the explanation that is not provable in this way. So that was like kind of the main thrust of my book is a unified theory of revolution. Okay, moving on quickly now. So the next thing I want to say though is I spent a lot of time after Occupy trying to understand why the movement failed, but lately in the last 7 months, my thinking has really shifted instead to this question of not why did Occupy fail, but what can something like Occupy be used to achieve? Like if you look at Occupy not in its ideological content, but instead as a social phenomenon, then it becomes a question of like, well, what can we do with something like a social movement that spreads so quickly? I believe that social movements are like there's something deeply human. Like we have records going back to 3,000 years ago, ancient Egypt. We have papyri that talk about a revolution, overthrowing a king. And so we know that for like the last 5,000 years, every generation or so, there have been these like uprisings that have like demanded or achieved change in their societies. So if we look at social movements as a social phenomenon, then I believe that they hold the key to something. They hold the key to basically society making great leaps forward. They serve a kind of social evolutionary function, right? And we kind of know this as activists because one of the narratives that we have as activists is that like all of the good things in our world were created through protest, kind of like the 8-hour work week, the fact that we only have to work 5 days a week, like all, democracy, universal, like all of these things were the result of protest and revolution. But I think we've overemphasized the ideological component and not considered also just this aspect of like, the way humans change their societies is this weird social phenomenon of rising up and suddenly like over demanding change in this weird way. So this leads me to the World Economic Forum and Davos, and so in the last 7 months I started to develop this argument that social movements are a social phenomenon that plays a useful function, evolutionary function in our societies, and that they can be used to create change, and that in this particular moment they need to be used to create climate change, like climate mobilization. That the only thing that's going to allow society to make like the great transformations that we need for climate is going to be like a social movement. But together with that is the only way that a social movement will grow to the scale necessary is if it's tacitly or directly supported, or at least allowed by elites and governments and this kind of thing. So underneath this argument is that for the last like 300 years, like the primary activist strategy has been class war and political struggle because of the conflicts in our world really were political. Like in 2002, I almost got arrested in an anarchist protest against the World Economic Forum. And because I think that it was true that back then, the primary challenges in the world were political, and it was right to be opposed to these people because they were making political decisions that were impacting us all. And if we could and the argument was like, if we could influence their behaviors, then the world would be a better place. But now in 2020, it's much different. The challenges that we face is existential. It has to do with this. It's not necessarily a political challenge. It's really a challenge of that all of humanity and all of biodiversity, all of our lives are at stake, in this thing. And that is pushing elites and activists together, because the argument goes that they need us and we need them in this weird way, even if we don't like each other, even if we're adversaries. So I started to write these. So I wrote this argument. I wrote this for them, and you can go on the World. If you just Google World Economic Forum, Micah White, and then you can read the 2 articles I've read for them. They put them online, where I make this argument. And so someone at the forum told me, that article was really, we liked it internally. So here you are, an invitation to Davos. It was like my reward is that they liked the article. So now I get to go to Davos. Okay, so So I accepted the invitation to go to Davos, and I wrote an article about why I was going to Davos on The Guardian last week that got like so much hate. I knew it was going to be reputational suicide. I actually told the people at the forum, I was like, if I accept your invitation, it's like I'm done. You know what I mean? Like, but I'm going to accept it because I personally do believe that we'll talk about this later, but I think it would be absolutely naive and foolish and horrible to continue to pursue like the last 300 years of activist strategy. And even if we get a revolution, we would lose on climate. I really believe this. I feel like, anyway, so I went to Davos to make this argument of the need for what I'm calling like a united front. So a united front is like a specific term. I use this term because I don't like to use the idea of a coalition or working together, because coalitioning and working together often means that we have to be the same, and then there's pressure on everyone to be the same. And like, no, precisely what's needed is that we maintain our difference but fight together, because we can't anyways, I'll talk more about that. But the idea of a united front is that adversaries work together on a greater goal and resume their conflict once that goal has been achieved, or the united front falls apart. And so the best example of this is that Chinese communists under Mao formed a united front with Chinese nationalists in order to defeat Japanese imperialism. Once they defeated Japanese imperialism, the conflict resumed, and Mao won. The communists won. So for me to advocate a united front is not for me to say that we are going to lose at the end of the united front. It's merely to say that we are temporarily suspending the adversarial relationship in order to first deal with this other thing that both sides of the conflict need to deal with, and then we will resume the conflict after that. And so the World Economic Forum they see one of their powers is what they call convening power. They have the capacity to get really powerful people together. So they were nice enough to organize a closed-door meeting between industry and activists. There was actually I'm not supposed to say who was there, everyone was there, but there was someone from Extinction Rebellion who was there, and he can tell you his perspective on the whole experience when he gets back, or when he talks to you guys next. But also in the room were corporations, global brands who have together combined 500,000 employees. There was a union in the room that represents 30 million members in like 120 countries, just to give you the scale of what kind of people the World Economic Forum can bring together. And then there was activists from various like movements. That the meeting was held in this space outside of the central conference center, so that people who were not invited to the forum could get into this meeting. So that was really nice of them to do too. And I presented this idea of a united front. I handed out this manifesto that I wrote called Alliance of Opposites that is on the internet now. You can read it on the internet. But let me just try to pull out a couple things from the manifesto that I think are important, or at least provocative, which is this idea that so first of all, it begins basically, I think the 2020s will be defined by a collective race to drastically reduce global carbon emissions. Everyone at the World Economic Forum is totally on board with that. They totally accept, by the way, the climate emergency. Like, that's no longer a controversial or provocative. They accept that we are in a climate emergency. And they also accept that we need to mobilize hundreds of millions of people across the world. My second point is that we have to, so I could just read this. It's only 4 minutes long. Do you want me to read it or summarize it?
Read it.
Read it. Okay. So it says, what we need. The 2020s will be defined by the collective race to drastically reduce global carbon emissions. The scale of the reduction necessary, 7.6% decrease each year for 10 years, although I heard from Gail yesterday that it's even larger than that, 25% reduction in the UK apparently, is unachievable without an unprecedented global social mobilization for massive climate reduction efforts such as planting 1 trillion trees. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. The mobilization will involve hundreds of millions of people spread across 195 countries. So the World Economic Forum themselves have said hundreds of millions of people. And it will require the periodic suspension of everyday work, life, and travel, beginning from where we are. The global climate mobilization must start today with the governments that exist now, the activists that are alive now, and the distribution of wealth and power as it is. So this is me pushing back against some sort of utopian notion that we're going to first have a revolution and then from there proceed into a climate mobilization. No entity, no government, corporation, no industry, no civil society organization or protest movement can achieve this scale of mobilization without collaborating with its adversaries and competitors. I believe that is really true. Governments and industry need the vital mass energy released during protest movements, and protest movements need the tacit support of law enforcement to grow to the size and intensity necessary to get hundreds of millions of people into the streets planting trees or other action that you believe is necessary. So activism is essential. Protest movements cannot be created by anyone at any time. This is part of my core theory of change. The emergence of a protest movement is a precious opportunity for all of society to quickly achieve great social changes. This is true regardless of the grievance that ostensibly sparked the movement. In the last decade, activists have proved to be one of the few forces capable of sparking a global social protest. Now, I say one of the few forces capable because I wanted to say the only force capable, but then there are some of those clandestine military, some social mobilizations perhaps have been pulled off by clandestine military CIA type stuff. So, I don't know. But activists are one of the few. The end of politics. Activists and activism are needed for a higher purpose in the 2020s than the pursuit of political revolution. The appropriate activist strategy for today is an alliance between opposing social forces, protest movements, governments, activists, industry, and civil society that has the capacity to mobilize sufficient numbers of people and equip them with the necessary resources. Governments and industries that join an alliance with activists have a chance of surviving the climate emergency, which is also an argument I think that they fully accept. At least that they're trying to get on the right side so they can survive. A united front. The universal task of activism in the 2020s is the formation of an alliance of opposites, a united front for climate mobilization. In the culture of activism, a united front is the strategy of working with adversaries in order to achieve a greater goal. The united front for climate mobilization is global, temporary, and outcome-oriented. The united front is fostered through the sacrifice of something vital to gain something essential. So for industry and governments, this means giving free rein to climate protesters by enacting a global moratorium on suppressing climate protest movements, providing a universal basic income for climate activists, and legislating the prohibition on climate change denial. For activists and social movements, the United Front entails a reorientation of all movements toward climate in the face of other existing injustices and turning away from political revolution as an objective, except in countries where the government is hostile to the climate mobilization. Each of us has an obligation. The United Front aims to channel the vital energy of all movements and protests that emerge into the goal of climate mobilization. So I say this because I don't think that it's as if we're going to get every single activist to protest around climate. Instead, what I'm trying to say is that any protest that occurs, the only outcome that will be tolerated is climate related. So if they're protesting around a fare reduction, they increase the public transit costs in Brazil and millions of people go into the streets like they have been, then what we say to them is, that's a legitimate concern, but really what's driving you is climate anxiety, and we will work on climate. The climate emergency is an existential threat. As such, it obligates each of us to contribute that which makes us unique. So governments are obligated to devote their sovereign powers to foster the mobilization. Corporations and elites are obligated to devote their financial resources to fund the mobilization. Civil society is obligated to devote their employees, supporters, and networks to further the mobilization. And activists are obligated to devote their activism to catalyzing the mobilization. And then decisive struggle. The 2020s will be defined by the decisive struggle between those that accelerate change and those who resist it. So I put that last line in there to really try to move activist strategy away from, since Aristotle basically, it's been understood that the core conflict of politics is between rich and poor, and that's why we've been pursuing class war. But this is an argument that the Forum makes that I agree with, which is that actually the conflict in this next decade is going to be between those who are embracing change and those who are resisting change, because we're all going to have to be changing a lot, you know what I mean, in ways that are going to be painful. Not all the changes that we're going to need to do for climate are things that are going to be easy for us to do, even as activists who embrace the need to do those changes. So they organized a private door session. I presented that manifesto to people and got some various feedback that I think indicates where the lines of conflict are going to be. So for activists, it was around an unwillingness to give up income inequality as the central organizing goal. For corporations, it was an unwillingness to accept that the mobilization can has to be like unruly and disruptive. Like they're like, why can't it just be like a nice thing? And I really, actually, I think someone maybe was quoting Roger's work to me yesterday about, oh well, action leads mobilization. I think Robin said that. So everything is true. It's something that I don't think you can build a movement of that scale without disruptive actions. Like I think that's actually what motivates people to join movements and get into movements. And so that's what the argument I was making to them, is that you're going to have to like see people blocking traffic in airports or whatever and just not suppress it. Like that, there's just no way to get to 100. You can't even get to Occupy spread to 82 countries, 1,000 cities. I don't even think we had 100 million people. You know what I mean? So they're talking hundreds of millions. That's impossible. It's without that. Okay. So that was interesting. We can talk more about that meeting. The last thing I want to say, and then we go into questions, because probably said a lot, is this idea of the Trillion Tree campaign. So I really like the Trillion Tree campaign. Okay, I first read about the Trillion Tree campaign in The Guardian like 6 or 9 months ago, and I instantly thought, this is a really good campaign. So the basic concept is, if you plant 1 trillion trees, it will reduce 10 years of carbon emissions. It'll give us 10 more years, right? I like it for the following reason, mainly because in order to plant 1 trillion trees, it would be a fundamental transformation of the status quo. In order to mobilize that number of people and resources to plant that number of trees, it would in fact be a victory for social movements. So it turns out that the powerful and elites love the Trillion Tree campaign, and they are going to they have really embracing the Trillion Tree campaign. I was surprised by this. So the World Economic Forum announced 2 weeks ago that they are endorsing the Trillion Tree campaign, and they believe it'll take hundreds of millions of people in the streets to do it. And I elbowed my way into this high-level planning session at Davos around this topic, and they had Jane Goodall was there, and they had CEOs in there, they had foreign ministers in there, they had it was super high level. And so here's some of the things that they believe are going to happen. First of all, the White House, Trump has already endorsed the Trillion Tree campaign, but the White House is going to endorse the Trillion Tree campaign, and they're going to convene some sort of gathering to talk about it. Also, this year, Saudi Arabia has the presidency of the G20, and Saudi Arabia, the finance minister of Saudi Arabia was in the room, and he says that the G20 is going to endorse the Trillion Tree campaign as well this year. And collectively they intend to raise $300 billion for this effort. They're building, so they've already built this platform called 1t.org, and they're going to release this. So Salesforce is helping them, so they have a lot of resources. So they're releasing an app called Uplink that they're going to be trying to use, and all this kind of stuff. So basically, my first point of information is just that Trillion Trees is now going to be officially endorsed by the powers that be, and activists now have a choice, I think. You can jump on the campaign now, because I think it is a good idea for reasons that we can keep discussing, which would be smart, before these people, many of whom we do not like, endorse the campaign, at which point it'll be more difficult for activists to accept it, or we cannot. But I think that it presents a unique opportunity to use the Trillion Tree campaign as a Trojan horse to kind of do other things. So that's kind of the main thing. I mean, there's so much more we could talk about, but that's kind of like an overview of.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we had this conversation yesterday, and I think I'd like to just give a few reflections from that we had yesterday, because it feels useful. But I'm dying for that polyamory line again. I loved it yesterday. Do you want to just share that? It's totally irrelevant. It's quite funny.
No, I was just reflecting on I think I was asked something like, what were some of the symptoms of the collapse of Occupy? And I said polyamory was one of the symptoms of the collapse. Once people started talking about polyamory, the movement was done.
And also that it was very traumatic when it was over, so
it was.
Folks.
It was. Yeah.
I think it's a really, really massive. I don't know who's got the WEF, the World Economic. Have you got it, Roman? That this is wall to wall climate and ecological. Well, I don't know how much it's ecological crisis as well. Within a year that people have accepted there's a mobilisation. I mean, folks, right? Globally, this is our efforts and Greta's and the fight. But that's massive. And I think we just had a bit of a crisis after October, and I think we just have to be really, really fucking pleased with what we've done, you know. So it's huge. It's huge that that's genuinely being said.
Yes.
And the bit where we're adversarial, I was saying yesterday, I think the feckless hip in me still hopes that as part of working together there will be a shift in human consciousness that brings more love between us and more reconciliation. But there's no naivety in that. I think it would be interesting for XR to use some of the people's assemblies that are happening to think about this trillion trees. It feels simple to me that there's a yes and with it. But it actually really sparked something that you said, Roger, to me last week about there's a moment when the elites get you to dig your own grave. And when you think about...
There's a moment they get you to
it was
dig
a really dark call. Like, first call, we were always like... I was like, after, like, fucking hell, you know. And actually, what if there's a moment when the elites get us to dig a load of trees as a distraction? Of course we want to dig trees, right? But 10 years off the climate emergency, when we know when the ice goes, there's 25 years of warming baked in. Where's the actual fucking plan? You know, so will the trees become a distraction while the elites are up to looking after themselves? Where's the deep adaptation plan for the countries and the places most at risk? I mean, one of the things that Micah was sharing yesterday was that there are, like, Miami is going to go under and it's going to cost a shitload, and to protect it is going to cost the same amount of shitload, so they're just going to let it go under, type of thing. So, and that's Miami. So what's going to happen to Africa? So where's the plan? And are we all going to be going, ooh, we're planting trees, isn't that great? Do you see what I mean? So there's a real caution in that for me, that we're not digging our own graves, we're digging our own trees. How clever of the elites if we end up getting lost in that. And I really loved the thing that you were saying about the negotiation points, in a way, the obligations and so on. That they'd been saying, you know, we're not up for system change, we're up for changing the system. And it sparks me of... Sorry, what?
Other way around. They don't want change of system, they want systems change.
Okay, anyway, essentially what they meant was we can't change the economy, we can tweak it or something. I mean, it strikes me as incredible hubris that they don't realise that the system's over, it's going to collapse, you know. It strikes me as a deep denial and a lack of clarity about what's happening. And that one of the ways that the system will need to change is there will have to be a redistribution of wealth, not for ideological reasons, but because there's no way that we can do that change without something like carbon rationing that implies rich people putting that you know, like Microsoft saying that they're going to get rid of the emissions that they've made. There's going to be financial cost, and ordinary people have not got the money, so you know, it's kind of like a non-debate in a way in my head. But the other interesting thing that you shared yesterday was that they have got like really extensive data on what's coming, really detailed data about the emergency that's proprietary and they're not sharing with us.
Yeah, so there was this session, it was super interesting. It's actually one of the best sessions I went to, was this session led by, and I can find it in here later, but led by someone from the S&P who is, you know,
SDP.
S&P of the S&P 500. So they basically, what they did is they created this internal project in partnership with, like, I think Carnegie Mellon or another university, where they mapped all of the resources owned by the S&P 500, the largest companies in America, all around the world, and then they layered on top of that different scenario projections for, like, if we fail on climate action, if we succeed, and then what the impacts will be for those assets. And this is what Gail was referencing, is that one of the maps he showed us what will happen to Miami if there's only a 1.5 meter sea level rise, which is like the most conservative, like if you know, like the most likely scenario, not most likely, that's definitely going to happen, basically, at least that. And all of these resources, all of these buildings owned by the S&P 500 are going to be underwater. And then he said the cost of protecting those buildings is equal to the cost of their destruction. So basically, there's no incentive for them to do anything to stop the loss of those buildings.
So the interesting point to me, though, is the amount of data that
Yes.
they've got. They will be knowing in great detail what's coming, and they're not telling us about it. So one of the things, I've been working on a project called XR Money Rebellion, which may involve some kind of debt strike. and we've been thinking about 3 demands, and it seems to me that they're really perfect for our negotiation if there is ever such a moment, which would be tell the truth, international bodies, WEF and others. Well, we don't need to get them to tell the truth in an emergency, they've got that, but there's the reason for the emergency is there's problems in the system. And give us the data, share the data that you've got. Let's have it. You can't have that information on your own. The second thing would be the ecocide law. We want you guys criminalising if you're doing mass damage and destruction. It can't be this, we're doing it voluntarily. If you're saying you're not going to do it, then sign the ecocide law at the Rome Statute level. And the third thing would be we want an international citizens' assembly to rewire the system, to look non-ideologically at what's going off with the regulatory framework, with when we get into sort of debt-based growth, with where investments are going, financialisation, blah blah blah. Looking at some of the systemic issues, and in a non-ideological way, coming together with economists and ordinary people to say where the shift needs to be in a really big systemic shift. I think that to me, and saying we will do the trees thing, it's like, yeah, the trees, sure, and this, Like, so it feels like there's quite a big international play off the back of Davos. So that was my reflections about the trees and so on. Does anybody have questions for Micah?
Just thinking about the idea of sort of getting people from different interest groups to towards the same changes, and that being a kind of sign of symmetry, and we're living in a kind of world in which those sort of symmetries have been assaulted and fractured, and we don't share the same cultural touch points at the same time. We're all over the place, the media, the Facebook bubbles, however you want to put it, and recognising that kind of in some ways asymmetrical warfare being a theme, and a culture war and all these things. How do you think that symmetry occurs at scale, at pace, in a kind of, like, do you think the idea of like the Mid-Trillion Trees project is the means to which everybody feels they have to play a part in that, or is there a...
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is yes. I think that so it's important to point out that the World Economic Forum is many things. It has many different. The way they're organized is actually very sophisticated. So much so I don't even quite understand exactly how they have platforms. They have this. So I was given a particular experience of the World Economic Forum, and I was allowed to, or I was introduced to certain kinds of people and places. So I can't really say what percentage of WEF or what percentage of the World Economic Forum believes certain things. I can only tell you I met people who believe certain things, but I would say that the segment that trying to recruit me in is a civil society segment, and I think that the civil society segment believes that yes, that we're going to have to mobilize massive numbers of people, and that's going to require social activists, because I think they accept I think they're accepting the argument that people like the traditional civil society, like Greenpeace and Oxfam, who goes to Davos as well, is not able to create something like XR. They're just not. They weren't able to create something like Occupy, and they're not, and they won't be able to create what happens next. So WEF is trying to understand how to deal with these new kinds of, social movements, and so in terms of I think that that's the inroad. That's what opens the possibility to working together, is because sometimes they believe that they need you. The reason why they're bringing Greta is because I think that they believe that they need, if not Greta, something about her capacity, like something about the climate strike and all that social movement stuff. They need that in order to achieve their agenda. But I think that having gone to the Trillion Tree planning session, I would say that many of them don't think they need you or us, and that they think they can do it by themselves. In that meeting, I felt like they definitely think they can get the Trillion Tree done. They're not asking for permission on the Trillion Tree. They're going to do the Trillion Tree. I don't know if they'll be able to pull it off. They believe they're just going to do it. It's already done in their minds. But they understand that it's going to be difficult and everything, but they didn't think that they need anyone that was outside of the room. And so I'm still pushing on them to understand the need movements. So what I'm saying is, it's not a foregone conclusion that they would actually want to work with social movements. It's just that there's some people within the forum who do believe that they're going to need that, and there's some who probably think that they don't. So it's not like guaranteed. Yeah.
In two parts. So the first bit might influence the second bit. But just taking on this trillion trees thing. There's the movement in Africa called the African Green Belt, and that was a huge thing, like a branding thing. Everyone was bought into it and thought, and billions were spent. But you also look at I was looking at which parts of Africa was affected in Ethiopia and the Tigray region, where there was all that big campaign about starvation and everything. You look at now, and that's green. There's loads about how it's been greenified, but it's not because of the green belt. That was kind of interesting. It was because of a bottom-up movement that came out from that starvation and facing that threat, and then led to them mobilizing and creating their own communities. So it's that sort of sense of the platforming of we're going to do this billion, and the money that goes will be into one thing, but not necessarily into the things that are needed to meet the deep adaptation needs. So it's just.
So I mean, it's again. I think that they're very sophisticated. So I would say on that point that they have already adapted to that critique. So in the room they had this woman. I forget her name right now, but she's the UN representative of Indigenous people. So there was she was a very powerful voice. She got up and started not denouncing but speaking strongly to the CEO of Salesforce and stuff like that. And they also had in the room this yogi mystic, who's again, his name escapes me, but I know he has also planted millions of trees. So what I'm saying is we have this notion that they are naive and cynical in everything that they do. But what I'm saying is they want to get it done. So they also are trying to incorporate indigenous voices and this and that, so.
Yeah, so it's not that I think that they are. So I used to work as a lawyer in sort of corporate world, so I can see that there are different sort of perspectives. Yes. So this is a quote from one of your articles, which is quite interesting, feeds into this. It says, the awareness of the powerful need to mobilize common people in order to achieve their strategic objectives has had the effect of altering the dynamic between activists and elites. So it's about whose objectives we are facing and what's in the middle. Yes, the territory is changing and it's disrupting, and we are meeting each other. It's like the chicken and egg, like the chicken race, the territory, and we've both got to move. We've both got to who's going to blink first, and that negotiating as a negotiating tactic. Whose strategic objectives are we moving and into what kind of settlement around equality, power is the shift, because there's always been uneasy alliances. So during the second, Cromwell with the New Model Army, that was from the poor coming together, but then they were betrayed by the grandees. Point which there could have been a new constitution. So looking at the history of those sort of movements, when there are these uneasy alliances, what elements become part of that alliance is crucial, so that we understand, the power dynamics.
Yes, I think the terms of the alliance would be power and wealth stays, the elites stay the elites during the duration of the alliance. You know what I mean? So that's just, because I think, as far as maybe they'll mix it up next year, but as far as I can tell, they believe they have 10 years to act, and trillion trees is all they're going to be doing. Unless they come up with another idea next year. I think,
Let me just track because it's Jessica next, and then Roger, Toby and Will. Yeah. Sorry, Charles. Yeah.
I think my question is a little bit similar. So probably there isn't really an answer. So you were talking about this coalition where we suspend, our conflicts while we aim to. But the trouble is, for example, I'm writing a novel about climate stuff, and I get fellow writers to read it, and they say, but Jessica, the jeopardy isn't specific enough. Because just saying there's a proportional problem that this might happen, that doesn't feel like the aliens are coming. It's, they begin to get it, but it's quite hard because it's maths and it's science and it's probabilities that we're kind of. So when do we decide? Oh yeah, we've reached. We've only got 5%, so now we're back to battle as normal. There isn't. It's not like a war where there's going to be somebody defeated and it's like, hooray, job done. Now let's get back to the rebellion or the revolution or whatever. But what I suspect in my heart, partly following from what Marcia says, is that it's going to be a process. And once you get involved in the process, there are sort of dynamics in it which, of course, the elites are going to want to keep their place. But once we're in that kind of powerful flow, things might change and fall out in different ways.
No, I think that's a good point. And I would say two things. Number one, you don't need to ask their permission to join the Trillion Tree campaign, and you can carry it out in any way that you want. So it's not like, and I'm saying you would somehow work. You don't have to actually even work with them. All I'm saying is that that planting a trillion trees becomes one of the narratives of your movement, and then also they announce the same thing. It can be even that informal. The second thing I would say is, this is kind of unrelated, but it's something that you should know that they're going to do too. The other thrust they're doing is they had this thing, like Al Gore and a bunch of Jane Goodall and whatever are supporting this initiative, which is that one of the problems that they see in mobilizing people for climate action is that all of the most compelling imagery and data is copyrighted. And so even when they helped fund the production of Our Planet, but then that film is owned by Netflix, so even when they want to use the footage, they can't, or they have to pay for it. So what they're going to do is they're going to fund the team that did these 4 Our Planet and the other 4 amazing ecological documentaries, and they're going to go out and reshoot all the footage, and then they're going to combine it with the best data visualization on showing the connection between. They're going to have amazing imagery of the fires in Australia showed with data visualization proving that it's connected, and they're going to release all of it copyright free and rights free. So that's actually another I thought was an interesting initiative, because if they actually do it and there's no gatekeeping and registration and stuff, it will be there will be a tremendous new volume of really compelling imagery and data that will help make the case for all kinds of different mobilizations.
Roger.
Yeah, in the paper I did, which initiated this whole shaboodle without sounding too big-headed, I put on that there's basically 3 paradigms of change. There's reformism, there's revolution, and there's existential. So in reform, everyone's sort of give and take. Revolution is there's a few bad guys and you take them over. Existential, it's everyone's interest to act together, unless you're a psychopath, right? Mm-hmm. So that's my argument, was the fundamental meta-strategic point of XR, as it turned into, is that we're all in this together. Now, so that reiterates what you're saying, and it's been reflected in XR, in talking to the elites, in not refusing to go to these sort of spaces, and. So I think the issues we need, I think we need more sophistication of what you just said. Sure it's more sophisticated than what you just said, and I think the 2 sophisticated sort of things here are to do a sectional analysis on the elites and a sectional analysis on the left. So the sectional analysis on the elites, in other words, is a normal distribution, and as I said in my World Wide Web talk, the 5% of the people that are moving, the 95% still knocking their heads in the ground. And it was a periodically collect. 200 people turned up to my talk afterwards, right? And 25% of them said they'd give money. So we sort of know what the stats are, which are massive, right? We've got billionaires who will give us loads of money, and potentially we've got big companies that will second management experts, which are the 2 things we basically need, arguably. So my approach to the elites is to say, sociologically you're fucked, right? You're toast. You're going to have bullets through your head, but that's a sociological judgment. And
what you meant by bullets through the head then was not from XR, by the way.
No. And then you read the transcript and make this absolutely clear that I'm in the liberal constitutionalist tradition, which is that people do bad things, then they go to prison, right? That's the liberal constitutional tradition, which they're part of as well. So, and this is what the left did to the capitalists in the 1930s. They said, if you don't support us, then fascism's going to win and you have a bullet through your head, right? So that's the stick, and the carrot is, we're not going to support that because we're non-violent and we're from the liberal tradition. So that's the carrot, and we're going to win one way or another because they are toast, structurally, everyone knows that and they know it. So that's one sort of conundrum that we've got to negotiate. And then the other conundrum we've got to negotiate is what to do with the left. And the reason XR is, up to October, XR was the left was going, oh my God, who are these upstarts? they're not playing the playbook of the left. And then October wasn't that great, and then the left have come in and gone, okay, you're our property now, and you've got to do this, that, and the other. And there's a massive force on that. And my fear is unless we're really clear about your agenda and my agenda, to be blunt, we're just going to collapse back into the left-right thing, and there's enormous power behind that. I mean, look at the Green Party. The Green Party is going more and more towards a liberal internationalist, liberal left, right? It won in Cambridge and Oxford. It's not going to win in Newcastle, right? Because of the culture wars, right? The Green Party is nowhere in East Germany. So my fear is the whole force of this is taking us to civil war in the Western world as soon as the shit hits the fan, because people distrust each other. And we're going to have to be really powerfully proactive in our messaging in order to break that. And the whole political class is going to hate us on the left and the right. I'm hated on the left, I'm hated on the right, which is exactly where I want to be. You see what I mean? And that's where I think XR should be. But the big plus point is 95% of the population doesn't give a shit about the political class because they're not in it. If you go out to Sunderland or somewhere like that, you've got people who want to sign up to Extinction Rebellion, never heard of the Green Movement. And for me, that's my sales pitch to XR, to say those people in liberal North London that hate Roger Allen or whatever, they don't count, no disrespect. The people that count are the women over 50 in Carmarthen. They're the demographic that we need to go for, and we just ignore, all the shit that goes on about it and focus on these people. So, that's a few. I mean, I'm being pretty simplistic, right? Obviously, but I think there's something in what you're saying and hopefully what I'm saying, which is hopefully what XR is going to adapt. Otherwise, we're back to sort of radical Greenpeace, aren't we? That's my proposition.
Yeah, and I would just say yes, and I think that what you just said is really important, and people should hear what you're saying, because I do think that, from a narrative perspective, to me, it is really telling. Like, if they agree that there's 10 years left, then they are essentially saying that when this 10 years is up, shit hits the fan. Like, they're not going to be able to say, oh, just kidding, we actually have another 10 years.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, at the end of this 10 years, it is going to be, I think, a really intense period where people are just like, oh, like, now it's we all fight for scarce resources and it's civil war. So, and I think, and my concern, I do think they're setting us up, they're setting everyone up for that, because I just don't see any other narrative out of that in 10 years. So, no, I think what you're saying is really true. I think that it's good stuff.
I'm going to come back to
technical point, when you said 10 years,
Yeah.
That clock's been ticking for a while. Is that 10 years still keep on getting reset to 10 years?
Yeah, it's really, and it's not, even the S&P guy said that, one of the things he said, I was like, oh geez, he said that we have to reach peak oil consumption in 5 years, in 2025. So in 2025 has to be the highest, and then after it has to go down, and if it doesn't go down, then we'll never reach. So there will be indicators along the way, in 5 years we're going to know if a little bit more, we might already know in 5 years, so.
I mean, I just can't sit with that anyway, given that there's a net carbon emission from all the forest fires,
right.
Given that the ice is melting,
right.
We're breaching tipping points now, but anyway.
Yep. No, it's true.
Toby, go on the stack.
So I just, the point that you made, I mean, it's really at the heart of something you were saying, which is about this sort of trade-off between, for activists to set aside the goal of social justice and greater equality. So I'm interested in sort of hearing what you would say about the relationship between that and avoiding climate catastrophe. So if we park that in order to avoid climate catastrophe, but that is also fundamental to how we see the solution, to the solution, the options for solutions, then it's coming back in, or it must come back in within that 10-year time frame. So how do those things play against each other, and in relation to where the elites are seeing this, and in relation to, I suppose, I picked up on what Jessica said about flow, and that once things start happening and once things start moving, there is scope for different paths and different journeys, but I still find it hard to see how we can take the sort of the equality question in terms of power and resources out of the picture, collaborate, but then still get to where we need to get to.
Yeah. Look, it's not an easy thing. I would say a couple things. I'd say that as activists, we make these kind of calculations all the time, even though we don't admit it to ourselves. So we choose to focus on certain issues and disregard other issues. We just do. Like, and a common critique is that, like activist culture disregards like issues more relevant to African American people or women or trans people or this or that. So like there's no way, basically, everyone's trying to find their strategic path to the end goal. And we can't do all the paths. So yeah, like it is harmful. It is unfortunate that that activism has failed us to the point where we are forced now to choose. That's what I'm saying. I think it gets to Roger's point about we can choose to accept that this is an existential crisis that's forcing us to work together, or we can continue to insist that a political solution must come first before we deal with this other one. And I think that most activists, probably what's going to happen is that 90% of activists are going to insist social justice first, income inequality first. Isn't that what you're trying to say?
No, it's not, because I'm actually saying I agree with you that it's the existential first, it's climate first. But what I'm concerned about is that we can't do that without greater social justice. That has to be part of the solution, I believe, on the evidence. I might be wrong. People might be wrong, but how can we without? If that is part of the solution, then it needs to be baked into those 10 years. Not because it might be, we might be able to say actually let's just jettison that because we don't like it very much, or I don't have on principle, it's not a principle of saying it has to be there, but for practical reasons, if that is part of what is required, then that's a difficult one.
You're saying it's required because you would need that in order to do the mobilization?
No, in order to have in order to bring down carbon, unless we're prepared to accept the sort of the imbalance in the impacts. Maybe that's what we have to be prepared to accept. Maybe if we're really hard-headed, we have to say some people are going to lose out of these 10 years.
Well, absolutely.
Of course they are.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I don't know the answer to the question. Look, I think that they are, like this Microsoft's announcement to not only go carbon neutral, but to like offset all of the carbon that they've ever emitted during since 1995, indicates that they're preparing for a world where they keep their power and also they reduce carbon and also they mitigate climate and also in 20 years they're still in power and we've dealt with the climate emergency. And I'm saying to you, that scenario is not impossible. You know what I mean? Like, I think that on the left we like to assume that that solving climate is somehow also linked to overthrowing these people, but maybe it's true that So I don't know. It's.
I want to come back to that point as well, but it's just getting a lot of interest. But I do want to keep the stack going. So it's Joel next.
Thanks so much. Fucking amazing stuff. The question I have is that the idea of the suspending adversity between those groups and working together works really well when you think just of carbon and just of 10 years. But you zoom out to the extinction crisis and you zoom out to like what I would like my life to be when I'm an old man. And actually, I mean, really, when we talk about carbon and 1 trillion trees, there's like this massive growth bubble that's pushing all of the planetary boundaries in all directions, and it's bursting over here with carbon. And you're talking about 1 trillion trees is going to patch this, everything is going to continue this way. I mean, that fundamental thing that's pushing all of the boundaries of the planet is still filling. We're at, 2.5 times the total resources you can replenish yearly from the things. So the risk there, is it a lie to the elites to say you can still be the elites when essentially they only exist because they sit on top of this bubble, which sooner or later is going to take us all down unless it is brought down in some more natural deflation, i.e. moving away from growth. And in that sense, doesn't it mean that we're going to... It's just a lie, fundamentally, more than anything, isn't it? That you can still be elite, because once this thing has been brought back down within planetary boundaries, you've got nothing to sit on as an elite anymore because capital isn't supreme.
Yeah. It could be a lie, or is it like a strategic story?
Yeah.
Roger, want to jump in? Or?
Oh no,
Okay.
Yeah, and then let's keep this stack. But
Yeah, it's like a very similar sort of point. Like, you seem to frame it like that 20 years ago it was this problem between rich and poor, and now you're saying it's a problem of environmental collapse. But for me, it's all part of the same problem, which is like exploitation of workers, exploitation of the earth. It's just all to do with that constant desire to consume. If this is like a really an existential crisis, then like trying to say that we're going to get on board with just planting trees being a solution seems like a very small patch on like a very large problem, especially if you talk about people like the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, like condoning that while kind of raping the earth, like as we're speaking. Just feels like a huge kind of greenwashing thing and a distraction from the problem. Like how can we work with elites who still believe in economic growth, whilst that you had a kind of nice answer for how we could think that we could work with the elites by deflating their power. Slowly.
Yeah, it's like would they vote for their own destruction?
And they're not a monocrop elites.
Right.
That's the thing.
Yeah, that's the problem. I mean, I guess what I would say is that I do agree. I would position the trillion tree thing as more of a cover action. I think that one of the things they don't talk about, I didn't hear much, is like carbon reduction. Okay, so I think what I would do is I'd be planting trees while I'm also blocking airports. And then when they say you can't block the airport, you'd be like, what are you talking about? Look, I'm planting all these trees. You see, and you like confuse the issue. Because I do think like, obviously that I would be doing. I actually think there's a really interesting argument, by the way, that could be made, because they're all interested in carbon offsets. Okay, and some of them are required to buy carbon offsets, but apparently this Bank of America person was saying that there actually isn't a very good carbon offset market. So one of the arguments I think activists can make is that by blocking airports and power stations and stuff like that, we're creating carbon offsets. We're actually quantifying, like you can say, oh, we reduced this much. So no, I'm not trying to say that you would only do the trillion tree planting, but that the trillion trees is like the cover for other things. It is the cover for other actions as well. In addition to.
That's a great idea, carbon offset. There's been that will and then that will, and I was also wanting to join in on a track that you were there as well.
Yeah, I think it's more around the same theme, really. I can see how elites might see that they need activists to help coordinate this tree planting, and I can imagine us tree planting trees all along the HS2 route and things like that. But what I can't quite imagine is the elites getting involved with what we really need them to do, and that's to stop glamorising high carbon lifestyles. And they all fly on private jets. They extract incredibly extravagant meals. Do you sense that there's any appetite among these people to take it seriously to that extent?
Yes and no. Look, they claim that the World Economic Forum this year was the most sustainable conference ever done. All of the flights were carbon offsetted, they claim. But I was like, wow, this is amazing. I can't wait to see. But then I get in there and there's still single serve everything. I mean, so yes, they agree with you. No, did I walk in there and everything was, it wasn't like they had bulk sugar. They still had little sugar everything was still normal. But then they had some things like, oh, these are like high-tech food, plant-based proteins for lunch, and like our carpets are made of fish nets and like whatever. So yes and no.
Okay. I've got 3 of us in the stack, and I think if it's okay, we'll stop then, have a little break, and because it's a great segue into talking about wider strategy. Do you want to go, Will?
Well, it may be partly related to strategic conversations we're having, but you specifically mentioned, for example, fairly spicy actions like block a airport. Do you mean that specifically? Because I'm interested in how we build a kind of mandate for change, the sort of 60%, 50% of the population who get behind and agree with what we're doing.
Yeah.
As well as the thousands of people necessary to overwhelm the police force to drive change at that level.
Yes.
And how there's a tension that exists there.
Yeah.
And recognising that where we look at the data or the uptake or the uplift, the conversation may have changed, but like whether or not that's helped us actually generate the next million people, the next 5 million supporters, the next 30 million supporters.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to get a sense of like, because I'm checking, are you referring to actions that have previously occurred, or do you mean that very specifically in terms of how the relevance and use of having extremely potentially divisive components?
Yes, look, no, I am speaking literally. I think that I personally believe, just speaking of my own experience, sizable, I don't make very much money, but a sizable portion of the money that I do make is giving talks around the world. So I'm economically required, and a lot of people are economically required to fly. But let's just say that I was going to go to the airport and there's activists blocking the flight. Well, what a tremendous almost relief I might feel, because I'm sorry, I just couldn't fly. I just couldn't. So yes, I do think that there could be a positive side to just having once in a while, maybe, like I was trying to say to the climate strikers I met, I was like, instead of doing school strikes, just block the airports once a week, whatever, because I think that people don't, they don't have any, you need to give people permission to not fly. The only thing that's going to give them permission to not fly is if they can just be like, sorry, the airport got blocked. Like the strikers do it all the time, the labor striking, and until that time, like I have to get on the plane because I have to buy food for my family. That's just how it works. But once I'm given permission, because I can't fly, and I would do the same thing with power stations. There's a really interesting article from 2015 in The Guardian by John Jordan about their experience blocking some major carbon emitter. It only took like 100 people, and they prepared for it, and they just went in and they shut it down for a day. And they're able to quantify this much carbon was reduced this day. And I think that if I lived in, like where I live, if on Sunday at 5 p.m. the power all went out because activists had shut down the power plant and it came back on at 5 a.m. on Monday, and you could quantify like this much carbon was reduced from the thing, I personally think a lot of people would be like, that wasn't that bad. I lit some candles. I think divisive actions and this kind of stuff is what builds a movement. I think that people, when you pitch to the middle, you get nowhere. When you pitch to the edge, people chase the edge. It gives them permission, You have to give people permission to lose themselves, to go crazy. People went crazy in Occupy Wall Street. We gave people permission to go insane, quit their jobs, conceive children in tents. Literally, there's kids walking around who were born in a tent in Occupy. I know of this. It exists. There's a child, I know this one activist, her child was born in a taxi cab on the way to an Occupy protest. They carry that memory with them every day. So I think that I don't think you should shy away from divisive actions. I think that instead we need activists to help us, to force us to stop flying. There's no one to say no. We need someone to say no, Do
you think that that's still, I guess this one, going back to this analysis that where things were in 2012 in terms of media, in terms of control and government, I'd say the world is markedly different as of 3 months ago, as of 2 months ago, and that the way that the ability to change and shift public perception around the positives and negatives versus our own ability to make and form our own decisions is being extremely affected, and that I'm just, because this is such an important point, I'm just trying to get a sense of how we recognise where we are as a society and as a media-driven environment.
It's super hard. I think the last thing I would say is I don't think the goal is to shift perception. I disagree on that. I think the goal is to reduce carbon emissions and to create a massive mobilization that just interrupts the status quo. And this is one of, I think, the fallacies that came out of Occupy, and why people call it a success wrongly was that we shifted the discourse and changed, shifting perception is a byproduct of building a movement, not the goal of building a movement, is what I would say.
Thank you. I think we'll pick more of that up in the next session, so we'll maybe let that go for now. I'll make a comment and then Mothia can have the last word. I'm still fascinated with this trillion trees. It's like you can't really say no. Yeah. I mean, obviously we want to plant trees, and I believe part of it was not cutting down trees.
Yes.
As part of the thinking. But to me it's always that place of where does the thinking really lie for the people who really know what's happening? Where are they at really with this? Because Jonas Rockström said at 4 degrees C, he's now saying half the planet survives. So that's all right if you're a billionaire. You've got loads of money. So you're not thinking you're going to go. So our message is like, we're all going to go. I mean, the system might collapse and so on, but you know, the guys that are building the bunkers, that what's his? You know, there was a blog about it. This stuff's happening.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like, where are they on the spectrum? It goes from cynical to denial to a starting point. Cynically, is this a big distraction? Is this like, we'll just get people doing these trees and then they'll feel optimistic and it will cut some carbon out of the atmosphere.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, we'll get our bunkers, we'll get our plans together, we'll double down and, you know, fuck Africa, fuck Miami. Do you know what I mean? I mean, that's like, I think that's the most likely thing for like where they're at. And in that way, digging trees is digging our own graves to, you know, and not that we shouldn't be digging trees, right?
Okay.
But we just, our messaging needs to be really clear on what we're thinking about. And I love the carbon offsetting by shutting things down. The other thing is that they're in denial, that they're needing to feel like they're doing something. And that's all part of the process, isn't it, of denial. It's like, oh, we'll just do this thing. And there's a sort of usefulness to that point because... And then the other thing is it's a starting point. It's a starting point. It's the bit they can agree to now, the starting point of a real plan. You know, so where are they? Where are they on that spectrum? You know, and that's to me that's the question. And maybe some of them are in different bits of it, but we need to go like we need to be positioned with this as the launch event for actually having a real plan.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, you know, insisting that they look at the systemic issues through refusing debts and stuff like that, you know, like moving into the economic sphere and hitting them where it hurts. There's something of that in there for me. So it wasn't really a question, but it was a sort of summary of where my thinking's at since you've been talking about this yesterday. It's not to be, as I think Simon calls it, a lot useful idiots. And I think especially, it's a shame Tim's not here, but thinking movement of movements, like, you know, where the Fridays for the Future, what does it mean to the young people? Because they really have a much deeper sense of solidarity, I think, than we've got in our movement. Mothia, off you go.
It just kind of maybe follows up, or maybe it's thinking of a practical thing when you were talking about this alliance, and I think one of the things you mentioned was UBI. You said like. So this would be like a redistribution of like wealth and resources, and so rather than in this idea of like you've got to put to one side the social justice aspect, could it come through by saying you know this UBI, you can't give any conditions. This is the way you've got to meet us where we and that could be a way that the distribution happens in a different way. Yeah. And then the power gets equal because we've got more control of those resources.
I think that's a really good point. I think what I'm trying to say with the UBI thing is just that some of the resources that they can provide are, I mean, these like the corporations that were in this meeting, they have 500,000 employees, and they were already talking. What's going on apparently from their perspective is that their employees are demanding that the corporations be activists or at least tolerate activism. So their employees are themselves activists. Like people who are, think about it, people who are part of XR also work for these major corporations, and and they go to work and they put pressure on their bosses, and the bosses are feeling that. So this one corporation that has like 250,000 employees was like, we're going to start a training program for activists in our thing. They're like doing that already. And of course it'll be like not what the training program I would develop, but basically what I'm saying is like, the UBI is this way of saying like maybe you could just let your employees not come into work for a month or a week or whatever, and they still get their pay, but they get to plant trees and be activists or whatever. I don't feel like that's an impossible concept for them because they want their employees to be happy. Like
just to drill a bit, there's employment. I haven't read the whole thing, but Adam Smith, is talking about this is a way of redistributing. A way of distributing wealth among a society is through employment. So it's going beyond the idea of employment, but it's like the UBI as another way of redistributing these resources. So it actually goes beyond just the employers, because that just meets a particular demographic. But we're trying to meet everyone's demographic.
There's a debate between universal basic income and universal basic services, because income can imply more consumerism, but anyway, so let's have a break and gather at 1:15 back in here. There's a bit of food and drinks out, and we'll move on to